We're in our series Leaving Egypt, where we're looking at this ancient story of an oppressed, enslaved group of people. And they're in a land called Egypt. And we're looking at their journey out of slavery and their journey towards freedom. And we're making connections to our own life, because here's what I know. Slavery is a reality people live with every day. Now, this could mean literal slavery, right? Like people who are owned and who are coerced and manipulated, and they are trapped. But this also can apply to us spiritually, mentally, socially, emotionally. We are trapped and we are enslaved to something. Maybe you're enslaved to an addiction, to a past, to an abuse, a hurt, something someone did to you, something you've done to yourself. Maybe you're enslaved to your own fear. Maybe you're enslaved to a certain way of thinking and a certain type of living. But there's slavery that still exists, and all of us know what it feels like to be trapped. But then there's this, I believe this grander thing that is happening of slavery and freedom that we're also connecting this story to us spiritually. And look what Rob Bell says in his book, Jesus Wants to Save Christians. There's a far deeper, more insidious kind of Egypt. And this Egypt that we're talking about, it was this literal place at a time in history, and these people were leaving this, but it also represents the sin, the brokenness, the ego self, the thing that traps us and enslaves us. There's a far deeper, more insidious kind of Egypt, the kind that warps the heart and causes people to hurt and abuse and exploit each other. The real problem, the ultimate oppressor, is something that resides deep inside every human heart. The real reason for their oppression is human slavery to violence, sin, and death. There's an Egypt that we're all born into, and that's what we really need an exodus from. And so we said this last week, we looked at these verses, and this was the story, this kind of beginning catalyst of this freedom story. It says, therefore, this is God talking to Moses, say to the people of Israel, I am the Lord. I will free you from your oppression. I will rescue you from your slavery in Egypt. I will redeem you with a powerful arm and great acts of judgment. I will claim you as my own people, and I will be your God. Then you will know I am the Lord your God, who has freed you from your oppression in Egypt. And what we have here is referred to the 4 steps of liberation. It's a process. There's freedom to be had, but liberation, getting from one place to another, is a process. And so those are the 4 steps of liberation: to be taken out, to be delivered, redeemed, and then taken to something new. It's no surprise that enslaved people throughout history have looked to this story in hopes of their own freedom and liberation. This story resounds deeply in the African American community. And certainly at times throughout American history, they turn to this story of freedom and these steps of liberation. And then it also prompts what they call the 4 questions of Passover. And last week we talked about this meal and this celebration and remembrance with this moment, this meal that families had together who were oppressed, where at this moment, this will be the moment where the power of God would move them from enslaved people to free people. And it's this moment of Passover, and there's 4 questions that are around these 4 steps of liberation. And last week we said kind of the power of Passover is this: there's a way out. And we connected Passover and this meal and this moment and this story to Jesus. And that the Passover lamb was this picture of who Jesus would be for the whole world, and not just for one enslaved group of people, but for all of us who were enslaved in our own Egypt. And freedom isn't just a possibility, it's a present day reality. And so this week we come to the first step and question of liberation. The first step is being taken out. And so our Passover question is this: where are you locked in slavery? And are you willing to hear God's voice of liberation? This is what we're asking ourselves as we look at this first step, this being taken out. I said last week, I wonder how many people who were told, you do this Passover dinner, this process, God is going to use this to save you. That when that moment came, how many people, it doesn't tell us who actually were like, yes, we believe, we trust this, and who responded in obedience and who didn't, because maybe they were afraid, if I do this, these Egyptians are going to kill me. If I do this, it's not really going to happen. Our people have been oppressed for 400 years. I'm not going to believe that freedom is possible. But we said that when people put the blood on the doorpost and they had the meal and they were ready to go, that when they began to leave at this moment, it was their steps of obedience, their response to God's response. And so we're asking ourselves, where am I locked in slavery, and am I willing to hear God's voice of liberation? Because here's our idea worth discussing today. Freedom begins by answering the call of the liberator to be liberated. That's where freedom begins. Whatever's trapping you, whatever is harming you, oppressing you, keeping you down, whether it's this big S sin thing that kind of seems to underline all of us, where we all get it wrong all the time. We follow this ego self or these systems of the world, these systems of oppression, and we give ourselves that, whether it's that or whether it's something very specific. Freedom begins by answering the call of the liberator to be liberated. But this is also true. Liberation was about getting God's people out of Egypt and getting Egypt out of God's people. Because one of the things that we know about slavery, there's a psychological damage that is done. That you can be told that you're free and there's still a process. Maybe you've seen the movie, I think it's called Basic, with Anthony Hopkins, Cuba Gooding Jr., and it's about this gentleman who has studied these apes, and apes in the wild and freedom, and then apes in captivity. He said after a certain amount of time, you don't even need the walls anymore. The apes will stay right where they're supposed to be. Why? Because they don't believe that freedom is possible. They've been conditioned. And so while liberation was about getting God's people out of Egypt, they're free, this Passover thing, you can go. There was a process to be had and a process to go through because to get Egypt out of God's people. It's the same thing with us. What Jesus did for the world was about getting us free from sin, but then also getting the brokenness and the sin out of us. This freedom every day. Maybe you've experienced that. And so I want to talk about some truths about getting out as we look into this story a little more, this next step, okay, Pharaoh has said, get out of Egypt. They took things, they were given gifts basically from the Egyptians, like, here, take my money, just leave. Because having them in there was becoming more of a problem. And the people, they've responded in faith and obedience to God's response to their cries, and then they start out. And it's this very interesting thing that happens in the story. The storyteller tells us, they go the wrong way. They go out of their way. Instead of taking like the main road out of town, they go out of their way. And that seems weird, but the storyteller is very honest with them and said they did this on purpose. They wanted the king, they wanted Egypt to think when they looked at them, well, they're confused. They don't even know where they're going. And then something happened as they were being led through this thing where it looks like they're lost, but they're actually not. This is all part of the strategy. And something happens. It says, the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh. So that's like a Bible way of saying that he got real angry. And this thing that he had softened on, okay, I'm not going to oppress you anymore, just get out, he was hardened again. His heart was hardened. The king of Egypt. So he chased after the people of Israel, who had left with fists raised in defiance, right? These slaves say, we're out of here. And they're out towards freedom, and they left with their fists in defiance, and he's going to chase after them. He's like, you know what? We're not going to let them get away with this. We're more powerful than them. What am I thinking? The Egyptians chased after them with all the forces in Pharaoh's army. The military superpower of the day was coming after these people who had nothing. They were newly freed slaves. All his horses and chariots, his charioteers, and his troops. The Egyptians caught up with the people of Israel as they were camped beside the shore near a word I can't say, across from another word that I can't say with these two places. And here's something, a truth that I want us to pull out of this ancient story to our lives today. Maybe you know this to be true. Pursuit is inevitable. The thing that you've been freed from doesn't always let go so easily. It was almost like a given that Egypt was gonna get mad and come back after them. Right? Because what enslaves you in the past tends to pursue you in the present with the goal of imprisoning your future. And so you can imagine that at this point, they start getting scared because the leader of this whole thing, Moses, looks like he's lost. It was all part of the strategy, but he probably didn't have time to tell everybody, right? They look lost. They're wandering through, and they get to the Red Sea. They are trapped between a body of water and the forces of Pharaoh. They're being chased by the thing that enslaved them because it wants to enslave them again. Pursuit is inevitable. But let's continue. It says, then the Lord said to Moses, right? Moses is getting upset. People are getting upset. They're scared. They don't know what to do. He said to Moses, why are you crying out to me? Tell the people to get moving. Pick up your staff and raise your hand over the sea. Divide the water so the Israelites can walk through the middle of the sea on dry ground. Here's our lesson there. Progress is important. Action. Next steps. You know, one of the quickest ways to end up back in your Egypt, back in that thing that enslaved you, to let it take you, the quickest way to get back there is by getting discouraged at the process and the length of time and the patience that it takes to become a new person, a freed person. But progress is important. I love, if you look at it, what he says to them here, these are like actions, right? Why are you crying out to me? Here's what he's saying. Why are you still praying? Now, if maybe you're a church person, you're like, well, is the pastor saying I shouldn't pray? No, pray. It's good for you. But don't forget to also then move. Don't forget to do something about it because God is making a way. And he's telling them, why are you still crying out? Why are you wasting time on your knees? Why are you wasting time? Do something. I'm making a way out. Go that way even when you can't see it because it may require a miracle. Walking across this sea on dry land was going to require a miracle, and you may look at your own situation, your own enslavement, and think, yeah, for me to be free of this would take a miracle. And I'm here to tell you that when you start making progress, you start taking next steps and actions, that those miracles just begin to unfold in front of you. Not when you see it all clearly, but when you start to move, God wants to move in you. So let's continue with the story now. They walk across the Red Sea, and they walk across on dry land, and the slaves are now on the other side of this body of water as Pharaoh and his forces try to follow after. The Red Sea collapses, and they have this victory. This first step of freedom. They answered the call. They left. They didn't know what was going to happen, and this danger came up. This thing from their past was coming to get them. And it says, when the people of Israel saw the mighty power that the Lord had unleashed against the Egyptians, they were filled with awe before him. They had this moment of wonder. Like, sometimes we can think we're so big and we're so strong and we have it all. We know so much, and look at where humanity's come with technology and things like that. And sometimes we can really build ourselves up. When you talk about awe and wonder, when's the last time you felt really small and in need of something bigger than you to get you through? Maybe it was the last AA meeting you went to, right? And they talked about this higher power that you can surrender yourself to. You thought, yeah, that's what I'm going to need to get out. Maybe it's the last time you had to confront an abuser, this thing that has held on to your past and defined you for so long, and you saw a victory and you were just in awe that this happened or that forgiveness happened and freedom was happening. So they stood in awe before him when they saw this miracle. It says they put their faith in the Lord and in his servant Moses. Now they had already begun to respond in obedience. And when they saw a victory, it did what? It gave them more faith. When we step out in faith, we get more faith. Why? Because perspective is inspiring. On the other side of victory, our faith is stronger and even more prepared for the next difficult step. Because right now, they look like they got it all going on. You could think the story could end there. It does not. This story goes on for a grueling amount of chapters after this. This story is not over. They don't always get it right, but in this moment, they see this victory, and it inspires them to more faith. It's one of the reasons why I'm like, listen, you may not believe everything in the Bible. You may not even believe everything about God that this group over here says or this group over here says. But I think that when people start down a life of faith, what they find is that they have these victories, these transformations in their life that strengthen their faith for the next time. Because there will be another next thing that you have to trust God in. And guess what? It doesn't get any easier. This process only gets more difficult as we move towards freedom. So I want to connect it to this right here. Like God through Moses led Israel to freedom, God leads us to freedom through Jesus. The call of the liberator is this: Jesus has done something that changed the world, that changed history. His life, his death, his resurrection was this event that changed all of it for us, that freed us from Egypt, that calls us to freedom. Will you respond to that call? Look what Jesus said. He says, I tell you the truth, everyone who sins is a slave of sin. A slave is not a permanent member of the family, but a son is part of the family forever. And it's very interesting because this was a slave culture. Indentured servitude and slavery was par for the course just in this culture that was normal. And so when he connects this to slavery, people understood even more than we can, I think, exactly what he was talking about here with these family dynamics. And he ends it all with this: so if the Son sets you free, you are truly free. And then he would go on to die for the world, for you, for me, for history. Look at what the writer to the Hebrew Christians says. Again, they have this story, and he's connecting Jesus to this story of Passover and of Exodus. And he says, yes, by God's grace, Jesus tasted death for everyone. God, for whom and through whom everything was made, chose to bring many children into glory. And it was only right that he should make Jesus, through his suffering, a perfect leader, fit to bring them into their salvation, fit to deliver people. Jesus is a leader you can follow. He's fit to bring you out of what enslaves you. And a few verses down, it says, because God's children are human beings made of flesh and blood, the Son also became flesh and blood. God in a bod. For only as a human being could he die, and only by dying could he break the power of the devil, or you could say of sin, who had the power of death. Only in this way could he set free all who have lived their lives as slaves to the fear of dying. Jesus does this thing where he gives people hope in life and life eternal through his death and his resurrection. When people talk about born again, maybe that's a weird term for you, but maybe you grew up hearing it all the time. It's simply this idea that Jesus wants you to be free. He wants things to be new. He wants your brokenness restored. He wants you born again. And I'll tell you this, it's a process of being born again, again, and again, and over again, because Egypt runs deep in our bones. So, are you ready to be taken out? Where are you locked in slavery? And are you willing to hear God's voice of liberation? Because freedom begins by answering the call of the liberator to be liberated. I believe that Jesus is calling each and every one of us by faith to freedom. Freedom from sin and self and death and fear. He's freed you from Egypt, and we can follow him out of that today. But it begins by answering the call. And maybe that's for you today. You're saying, I've been locked in slavery. If the gates open, right? The cage is open, the chains are loose, then I need to walk out of it.